It all started with that familiar sinking feeling, the one that came whenever Karen was lurking around, waiting for a reason to make my life miserable. I had just pulled into my driveway, exhausted from running errands, when I spotted her. Standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was trying to squeeze the smugness out of herself. That telltale smirk was already forming on her lips, and I just knew, that whatever she was about to say would make my blood pressure spike. I hadn't even shut off the engine before she spoke. "That car is in violation of HOA regulations. Not hello, not good afternoon, not how are you today. Just straight to the Karen nonsense." I exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel for patience. "What now, Karen?" She took a step forward, her heels clicking against the pavement like some kind of suburban executioner. "We have very clear rules about the type of vehicles that can be parked in driveways overnight," she declared, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger in the direction of my car. "And that thing is absolutely unacceptable. It's a commercial vehicle, and our bylaws explicitly prohibit those." I frowned, glancing at my car. A black sedan. No markings, no signs. Nothing about it that screamed commercial. Just a plain, unremarkable car. I turned back to her. "Karen, that's not a commercial vehicle." She let out a condescending laugh, the kind that made me want to throw something. "Oh, I think it is. And thankfully I don't need to rely on your opinion." And then, of course, she pulled out her laminated HOA rulebook. Because of course Karen carried the HOA rules around like it was a sacred text. She flipped to a page and held it up dramatically, as if the sheer presence of her sacred document would smite me into submission. Section 14, B, Clause 7, vehicles used for business purposes are subject to immediate removal. She snapped the book shut with an air of triumph. "I've already reported it to the board. If it's not moved in the next hour, I'll be calling a tow truck." I fought the urge to laugh. She was serious. "You can't just tow someone's car because you think it's a commercial vehicle," I said, already feeling the familiar frustration creeping in. Karen's eyes practically sparkled with petty delight. "Oh, but I can. In fact, I already did." I blinked. "What?" Her smirk widened. "The tow truck is on its way." The moment she said it, I felt pure rage bubble up in my chest. I had dealt with Karen's nonsense before, but this was next-level insanity. "You didn't even give me time to move it," I argued, my voice tight with anger. "The rules are the rules," she interrupted, folding her arms. "If you actually read the guidelines, you'd know this isn't up for debate. The board agrees with me. That car is violating regulations, and it's getting towed." I shook my head. "Karen, you really don't know when to quit." She smiled, reveling in her power. "You'll learn to respect the HOA eventually." And then, as if the universe itself wanted to rub salt in my wounds, the unmistakable rumble of a tow truck pulling onto the street made my stomach drop. Karen turned toward the street with a look of pure victory. Ah, perfect timing. I clenched my jaw as the tow truck came to a stop in front of my house, the driver hopping out with a clipboard in hand. He looked between me and Karen. "Which vehicle?" Karen pointed dramatically at my black sedan, like she was some sort of TV courtroom prosecutor. "That one? Remove it immediately." The tow truck driver nodded and walked up to me first. "You the owner?" I shook my head. "No, it belongs to my wife." Karen scoffed. "Oh, and where is she? Because unless she moves it now, it's gone." I smirked. "She's at work. But I wouldn't touch that car if I were you." Karen let out a short, mocking laugh. "Oh, really? And why's that?" I took a step closer, lowering my voice just enough to make sure she paid attention. "Because my wife's an undercover cop." Karen's smug expression wavered. I let that settle for a moment before adding, And that's an unmarked police vehicle. Karen's mouth froze mid-smile. Her eyes flicked between me, the car, and the tow truck driver as her brain tried to process the information. The tow truck driver arched an eyebrow. Wait, did you just say this is a police vehicle? I nodded, keeping my gaze fixed on Karen. Yep, an unmarked, government-issued vehicle. For the first time ever, Karen looked genuinely speechless. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. Her hands twitched around her precious rulebook, as if somewhere in there was a loophole that could get her out of this mess. That doesn't make any sense, she finally blurted out. There are no police in this neighborhood. I laughed. Karen, you don't get to decide where undercover officers live. And for the record, my wife's been living here longer than you. Karen let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh, the kind someone makes when they realize they've just completely screwed up. This is a misunderstanding, she stammered. The tow truck driver frowned. So, let me get this straight. You called me out here to tow a legally parked police vehicle. Karen's mouth flapped uselessly. I was just enforcing the rules. I sighed. Yeah, looks like you just tried to illegally tow a police car. Karen visibly paled. Her face was going through every shade of regret possible. Then, as if the universe wanted to punish her even further, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. It was my wife. Karen visibly gulped. I grinned. Oh, Karen, you're really gonna regret this one. Just when I thought this situation couldn't get any more entertaining, my wife pulled into the driveway. Karen's posture stiffened immediately. Her eyes darted between my wife's car and me, as if she was desperately trying to figure out an escape route. But there wasn't one. She had dug her own grave, and she knew it. My wife stepped out of the car, still wearing her sunglasses, her usual composed expression shifting into one of confusion as she took in the scene. A tow truck parked in front of our house, Karen looking like she was about to faint, and me standing there, thoroughly enjoying the chaos. She pulled off her sunglasses and glanced at me. What's going on? Before I could answer, Karen, now in full-blown panic mode, threw up her hands. Officer, I swear this was a mistake. My wife arched an eyebrow. Officer? Karen's voice came out high-pitched and frantic. I didn't realize that was your car. I was just following HOA protocol. My wife turned to me. Karen called a tow truck for my car. I nodded. Apparently it's a commercial vehicle. Karen let out a wheezing laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they know they're in deep trouble, but are still hoping to somehow weasel their way out of it. I didn't know it was yours, she said, gripping her clipboard so tightly her knuckles were turning white. I was just doing my job as HOA president. My wife's expression remained unreadable as she folded her arms. So, your job is to illegally tow private property? Karen's mouth opened and closed like a malfunctioning robot. It was just a misunderstanding. The tow truck driver shook his head. Lady, you just wasted my time. You owe me a call-out fee. Karen's face twisted in absolute horror. What? I'm not paying for this. The driver shrugged. Not my problem. You requested a tow. You pay. A small crowd of neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. They whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from amused to absolutely delighted. Mrs. Henderson, the sweet old lady from across the street, smirked. Looks like Karen's finally getting a taste of her own medicine. Another neighbor chuckled. About time. She fined me $200 last month for leaving my garbage can out for an extra 30 minutes. Karen's head snapped toward them. This is harassment, she screeched. I have done nothing wrong. I was simply enforcing neighborhood regulations, and now I'm being publicly humiliated." Someone in the crowd laughed. "You mean like how you publicly humiliated the Johnsons for their overgrown lawn while their son was in the hospital? Or when you tried to evict the Martins for putting up Christmas lights?" Someone else called out. Karen's face turned an alarming shade of red. "That was different. I was protecting property values." My wife sighed, clearly losing patience. "Karen, stop. You're embarrassing yourself." And just when Karen thought this day couldn't get any worse, the police arrived. A patrol car, already on its way down the street, slowed to a stop in front of my house. An officer stepped out, taking in the scene with an expression of mild exasperation. "All right," he said, glancing between all of us. "What's going on here?" The tow truck driver gestured at Karen. "This lady called me to tow a police vehicle. Now she refuses to pay the call-out fee." Karen immediately went into damage control mode. She practically lunged toward the officer, hands raised as if pleading her innocence. "Officer, this is just a misunderstanding. I was simply enforcing our community standards when I—" The officer held up a hand, cutting her off. "Wait. You called a tow truck for an unmarked police vehicle?" Karen's eye twitched. I didn't know it was police issued," she blurted out. "How was I supposed to know?" "It didn't have any markings." The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. "So you didn't think to check before ordering a tow?" Karen let out a frustrated squeak. "The rules clearly state—" The officer turned to my wife. "Ma'am, this your vehicle?" She nodded. "Yes, and I'd like to formally report an attempted unlawful towing and harassment." Karen's entire body stiffened. No, please. There's no need for that. We can handle this internally." The officer pulled out his notepad. "Sorry, but I gotta file a report. Interfering with police property is a serious offense." Karen visibly swayed, like she was about to pass out. Her eyes darted around the crowd, looking for someone, anyone, who might come to her defense. There was no one. The tow truck driver lost patience. "All right, that's it," he grumbled, flipping through his paperwork. "Lady, either you pay me my fee or I'm filing in small claims. What's it gonna be?" Karen looked like she was about to explode. She turned to me, to my wife, to the officer, to the tow truck driver, her face contorting in pure rage. I raised an eyebrow. "Well, Karen?" For a moment, I truly thought she might actually scream. Then, with a growl of pure humiliation, she dug into her purse, yanked out her credit card, and practically threw it at the tow truck driver. He swiped it. "Thanks for your business." Karen snatched her card back, looking like she was about to burst into flames. By the time the officer finished taking statements, Karen had lost every last shred of dignity she had left. She stormed away from my driveway, avoiding eye contact with everyone. But as she reached the sidewalk, she turned back, her face twisted in venomous hatred. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I grinned. "Oh, Karen, I already don't." The crowd burst into laughter. Karen stomped away, defeated. For the first time in years, it felt like I had finally won. But Karen wasn't done. Not yet. Because that night, I saw her pacing on her porch, talking frantically on her phone. I had a gut feeling she wasn't just venting. She was plotting something. My wife noticed too. "We should keep an eye on her," she said, her tone serious. Sure enough, the very next morning, a new HOA letter arrived in my mailbox. A notice of formal violation. I opened it and smirked. Karen was trying to retaliate. But what she didn't know, I had one last surprise for her. The next morning, I woke up to find an official HOA violation notice stuffed into my mailbox. I pulled it out, already rolling my eyes before I even opened it. There was only one person in the entire neighborhood petty enough to retaliate this fast. And sure enough, as I unfolded the letter, Karen's name was plastered at the bottom. It was a formal violation notice citing, of all things, an unauthorized commercial vehicle parked in my driveway. I let out a short laugh. Karen was doubling down. After getting publicly humiliated, calling a tow truck for a police car, and having to pay a hefty fee out of her own pocket, she was still trying to win. I held up the letter as my wife walked into the kitchen. "You're not going to believe this." She took one glance at the paper and immediately let out a dry chuckle. She must really enjoy losing. Karen wasn't just upset, she was furious. Over the next few days, the violations started piling up. First, it was the car. Then suddenly my grass was 0.5 inches too tall. The day after that, a wreath hanging on my door was deemed an unauthorized decoration. She was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick. I tossed the latest violation letter onto the growing pile on our kitchen counter. "You think she even realizes how ridiculous this is?" I asked. My wife smirked. "She doesn't care. She's desperate." That much was obvious. Karen had lost control, and she was trying anything she could to regain it. But what she didn't realize was that she had just made a huge mistake. Because she had already been warned by the city, her actions were being watched. And she had just handed me the last piece of evidence I needed to bury her. I didn't waste any time. I gathered every single violation letter she had sent me, along with copies of my legal parking exemption from the city, the police report detailing her attempt to tow an unmarked vehicle, and screenshots of my correspondence with HOA officials who had ignored my previous complaints. Then, I sent the entire package directly to the city's legal department. Within 24 hours, I got a response. And the news? Even better than I expected. 2 days later, Karen's reign officially ended. City officials arrived at her doorstep. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as 2 officials in suits knocked on her door, clipboards in hand. Karen answered, her usual smugness nowhere to be seen. The officials wasted no time. They informed her on the spot that the HOA had been found in violation of multiple housing codes and abuse statutes. Her harassment of homeowners, illegal. Her attempts to enforce rules that didn't actually exist, fraudulent. And the result? Karen was immediately removed from her position. Not only that, but she was also banned from ever holding an HOA leadership role again. By the time the news spread, the entire neighborhood erupted in celebration. People actually cheered. Someone even blasted music from their front yard. A direct middle finger to Karen's years of noise complaints. One neighbor set off a few fireworks, even though it wasn't a holiday. And Karen, she was nowhere to be seen. It was over. Or at least, that's what we thought. Because just when it seemed like Karen had finally been put in her place, the city discovered something else. And this time, she wasn't just dealing with fines and removal. She was facing criminal charges. The investigation into Karen's abuse of power had uncovered something much bigger than petty violations. It turned out that Karen had been doing more than just writing bogus fines and harassing homeowners. She had been embezzling HOA funds for years. She had been skimming money off the top, creating fake expenses, and funneling HOA fees into her own personal slush fund. When the city ordered a full audit, it exposed everything. And when the evidence was laid out in black and white, the city had no choice but to file criminal charges. Karen was about to go from HOA president to defendant. I was outside watering my lawn when the officers arrived. 2 squad cars pulled up in front of her house, and Karen stepped outside, still dressed in her usual pastel cardigan and pearls. Except this time, her face was pale as a ghost. The officers handed her a stack of papers. Her hands shook as she took them. This can't be happening," she stammered. One of the officers remained completely unfazed. "You're being investigated for fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. You have the right to seek legal counsel." Karen staggered back, slamming the door shut. I watched the whole thing unfold from my porch, a satisfied grin spreading across my face. A few weeks later, she was officially charged. The court froze her assets, seized her bank accounts, and barred her from ever owning property in an HOA-run community again. The neighborhood, absolutely thrilled. At the next community meeting, we took a vote. 100% unanimous. We dissolved the HOA entirely. Karen's once mighty reign was officially erased from existence. The day she finally went to court was the cherry on top. She stood before the judge, her once perfectly curated image shattered. The judge didn't hold back. 3 years in prison for fraud and abuse of power. A permanent ban from holding any administrative position in any neighborhood association. When they led her out of the courtroom in cuffs, she refused to look at anyone. And I watched from the back, arms crossed, feeling a deep, satisfied sense of closure. Karen had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for years. She thought she was untouchable. But in the end, she lost everything. And the best part? The neighborhood was finally free. The day Karen was sentenced was supposed to be just another day in the neighborhood. But for us, it was the day we had all been waiting for. People who had lived under her tyranny for years gathered in small groups, whispering, laughing, exchanging knowing glances. Some of us were glued to the news, refreshing articles, waiting for an official update. Others didn't need to hear it from the media. We had seen her being escorted out of her house in cuffs. The HOA queen was finally deposed. Karen had spent years making people's lives miserable, hiding behind HOA regulations, throwing around fines like confetti, and abusing her little position of power. And now she stood in a courtroom, facing the judge, her once pristine pastel cardigan looking slightly wrinkled, her carefully perfected air of superiority crumbling under the weight of reality. The charges against her were no joke. Fraud, embezzlement, financial misconduct, harassment, misuse of authority. She had thought she was untouchable. She wasn't. The judge didn't waste any time. "Ms. Karen Thompson, you have been found guilty on multiple counts of financial fraud, abuse of power, and harassment of residents under the guise of HOA enforcement." Karen flinched. The judge continued, voice steady, firm, unforgiving. "You used your position not to serve your community, but to harass and extort them. You manipulated regulations, issued unlawful fines, and illegally funneled HOA funds into personal accounts for years." Karen's fingers gripped the table in front of her, knuckles turning white. "And despite multiple warnings, you continued these actions, believing yourself above the law." She opened her mouth, probably to argue like she always did, but the judge didn't give her the chance. "You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for fraud and abuse of power, along with a permanent ban from holding any administrative position in any housing association in this state." Karen swayed. It was like the words had physically hit her, knocking the last bit of life out of her. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The courtroom was silent. Then the bailiff stepped forward, and just like that, Karen was in handcuffs. For the first time, she wasn't in control. She wasn't barking orders. She wasn't waving around a clipboard or dictating what people could do on their own property. She was just another criminal being led away. She refused to look at anyone as she was escorted out of the courtroom. And I sat in the back, arms crossed, watching, feeling nothing but satisfaction. Karen had ruled this neighborhood like a tyrant for years. She had taken pleasure in making people's lives miserable. And now, she had lost everything. The HOA was gone. Her reputation, destroyed. Her money, seized, her power ripped away. And as of that moment, she was no longer our problem. In the weeks that followed, something incredible happened. The entire neighborhood changed. For the first time in years, people were actually happy to live here. Gone were the ridiculous fines. Gone were the stupid, arbitrary rules. Gone was the constant paranoia that Karen would show up with a clipboard and a condescending smile, ready to ruin someone's day. The first thing we did? Decorate. Within a week, houses that had once looked painfully identical were suddenly bursting with color. People painted their front doors. Some put up string lights just for the hell of it. Garden gnomes, bird feeders, and wind chimes appeared overnight. The neighborhood was finally free. One guy even put up a giant inflatable dragon on his lawn, just because he could. If Karen had still been around, she would have had a stroke. And the best part? The mood changed. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had once been afraid to step out of line were now hanging out, laughing, barbecuing, sitting on their porches without fear of being fined for loitering. One Saturday evening, I sat on my porch with my wife, watching the sunset. She leaned back, sipping her drink, eyes scanning the street. "You notice it?" she asked. I smiled. "Yeah." It was peaceful, not just quiet, but calm. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like an actual community. "Think she'll try to come back?" my wife mused, smirking. I chuckled. "No way. Even if she wanted to, she legally can't step foot back in an HOA role ever again." "Shame," she said, lips twitching. "I almost missed the entertainment." I raised my glass. "To Karen." She clinked hers against mine. "To Karen, and to never dealing with her again." As the sky turned golden, and the sounds of neighbors laughing and enjoying their lives filled the air, I felt something I hadn't in a long, long time. Peace. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood was finally free.